These days, even the cheapest brand new graphics cards are going to cost you upwards of £200, and that's if you're lucky enough to get one at MSRP. And yet it still feels like just yesterday that we could easily and readily buy an entry-level GPU for under £100 directly from retailers. But with no sign of that glorious life ever coming back, is it time to consider this? A graphics card that was virtually pointless upon release, but perhaps a saving grace in 2022. Let's not kid ourselves, the RX 550 has certainly not gotten any better since its release, but could it be a worthwhile investment whilst we wait for GPU prices to come back down? Well, the RX 550 that we'll be testing today is the 2GB variant from Sapphire. There's also a 4GB variant of this card out there, but considering just how irrelevant even the 2GB variant was at the time of release, it's not often you stumble across the 4GB version for sale at a reasonable price. Thanks to its low power, the physical size of this card is absolutely minuscule, making it ideal for home theatre PCs, ITX builds, and upgrading old office desktops. But just how low power is it? Well, with a default core clock of 1206MHz and a memory clock of 1500MHz, we're slightly edging out the default speeds of the AMD OEM version. With 2GB of GDDR5 and a 128-bit memory bus though, we're certainly very limited. In fact, I'm expecting this to be one of our biggest bottlenecks in gaming, with a high likelihood of graphics popping. But with a TDP of just 50 watts, this is definitely a sensible choice for upgrading an old office PC, and the card requires absolutely no external PCIe power connectors either, taking all of its power from the PCIe slot itself. Released in 2018, that makes this a reasonably modern graphics card, and therefore has some of the more modern features that we've all grown to love, FSR potentially being the most important of those. Whilst not all games support FSR, having it as an option on this card could really help to unlock that much needed extra performance in the games that do support it. The card also supports AMD's built-in game recorder, Radeon Relive, as well as a whole host of other technologies, all of which you can see pouring across the screen now. What it clearly doesn't support though is virtual reality, and I tested this out with my Oculus Rift CV1 in Beat Saber, and whilst the game did open, and it technically ran, it was definitely not fun. I'm certainly not one to get motion sickness from VR, but this was seriously nauseating. It did not take long for me to feel very sick playing this. So then, let's take a look at some proper gaming benchmarks then. I've paired this graphics card up with my Ryzen 5 3600 and 32GB of 3200MHz DDR4 RAM. That way we can almost certainly avoid any sort of CPU bottleneck, and really push this card to its absolute limits. It wasn't long into testing that gameplay was even more disappointing than I had originally imagined. I always knew this was never going to be particularly amazing, but I did have higher hopes for this card. So I went back and tried to apply a pretty basic overclock to the card, and for each of our benchmarks I've included the overclocked as well as stock results. Despite Forza Horizon 5 being reasonably non-demanding, despite looking absolutely stunning, the RX 550 struggled, and I mean really struggled. So much so that most would get motion sickness from this. Such high speed movements with so much stutter and blur, ugh. It just really wasn't fun. At least until I overclocked it, at which point we gained another 7 frames per second, putting us bang on 30 frames per second, which certainly isn't ideal, but is just about my idea of the minimum viable frame rate. Halo Infinite was another challenge. At the lowest settings I could select, we were still unable to push 30 frames per second averages. Things really aren't looking good for this card. Once overclocked, however, this was the only application which would not run. Anytime I attempted to load this game with the overclock applied, the entire system immediately blue screened. So take the stock results as our best results here. In Fortnite, we had a much more playable experience. At default settings of 1080p medium, the gameplay was smooth enough for me to enjoy the game, but not great enough for the lack of quality and hiccups to go unnoticed. There was the occasional issue of textures taking a few seconds to load in with the correct resolution as well. If I were a young kid, this would be a decent enough first gaming experience, but for anything else, it's a bit of a drag. Our overclock results were pretty underwhelming too. With just a 3 FPS improvement, it really wasn't worth the hassle considering we were already hitting our 60 frame per second target. GTA 5 using 1080p at low settings was pretty playable with our stock GPU settings, but once overclocked we very nearly hit our 60 frames per second target, with a tad over 10 frame per second improvement from our overclock. GTA 5 is a pretty old game these days, so I'm not particularly surprised by this, but considering how popular it is, this was a good enough experience that I could happily play this game on this card for hours at a time. Rocket League is basically exactly what this card was designed for. It's an easy to run esports title, and so for the first time ever, we were able to get a playable experience using 1080p high. Yay! Achieving 75 FPS averages when overclocked and only a few FPS below with stock settings. I know Rocket League isn't exactly difficult to run, but it's proof that you can have a fun gaming experience at 1080p high on the RX 550. In Cyberpunk 2077, without making the game completely unplayable, I was able to turn the settings all the way down to 1080p minimum. Any lower made the game a blurry, unplayable mess. Thankfully, Cyberpunk supports FSR, which means we can render our gameplay at a lower resolution and then upscale and sharpen it in real time. I chose a render resolution of 70% as any lower was too blurry to play. FSR seems to work great, netting us a 50% improvement in FPS. However, when we're already running at such low quality and such low FPS, FSR has very little to work with, and so we're still very limited. Despite our clear improvement from FSR, it was still similar to a PS2 era experience, which for some is great, but if that's what you want, buy a PlayStation 2. Myst, on the other hand, was a much better example of FSR in action on the RX 550. Here we started with FPS averages of roughly 30 frames per second at 1080p low, but with FSR enabled, at 50% render resolution, we saw our frame rates jump up to nearly 100 frames per second. Take a look at the comparison on screen now, and feel free to pause the video to determine for yourselves whether you think the loss in texture quality is worth the jump in performance. If Fidelity FX Super Resolution was more widely adopted, then maybe the RX 550 would start to make a bit more sense for budget gamers. But unfortunately, Fidelity FX Super Resolution isn't more widely adopted, and so the RX 550 doesn't really make much sense for gamers. The RX 550 hasn't gotten better with time. We already knew that. But do you know what has gotten better with time? Integrated graphics and CPUs. Long gone are the days of the A10 6800K. That was a dark time. But we now live in a time when you could purchase a 5700G APU for roughly £250, and they are readily available. You can have a semi-competent gaming experience on them and still get a great CPU out of it. So if you're building a brand new PC today and waiting for the perfect GPU, then it probably makes more sense to design your PC to include strong integrated graphics, like the 5700G, and just wait for a dedicated graphics card slightly further down the line. If you're upgrading an existing PC or looking for a stopgap graphics card after your existing card died, then well, sure, maybe it's time to start to consider the RX 550. In terms of value for money, it's not great, and you could get much better if you could stretch your budget slightly a little further to something like the R9 290. It's older and no longer supported, but the existing drivers still work on Windows 11, and it's a much more powerful card. But if you really are limited to this budget, and you need a card right now, then well, I guess this is better than some of the alternatives. Frankly though, it's nothing special, and its only real advantage over other cards at this price is the ongoing driver support. And if you guys did enjoy that video, then be sure to hit like and get subscribed. I'm really hoping we've managed to make it to the 10-minute mark, but to be honest, I'm not so sure about that. So I'm just going to sit here and patiently wait until I feel more confident that we have. Yeah, I reckon we're there about now.